William Steinitz. Now, I said in the blurb Wilhelm Steinitz, and I may use the terms interchangeably. I may use the names interchangeably throughout, and I'll explain that in a moment. But if I make a mistake there, it's actually not a mistake because he went by both names at different times. So this we already know. We've talked about this a lot. Let's get straight into the fun part. William Steinitz was born Wolf Steinitz in Prague, Czechoslovakia, or currently the Czech Republic, on May 14th, 1836, to a very large family, which we're going to get to. And he died, and actually, interestingly enough, he was born in a Jewish ghetto. If you've studied the history of anti-Semitism, you'll know that at various times in history, Jewish people have been rounded up and placed in ghettos where they had to live, work, die in that neighborhood for the most part, and they couldn't really get out. This was true for Steinitz and his family. They were born in the ghetto of Prague, and he lived there until he was about 18 years old when he moved to Vienna, Austria. But it's important to note that his family is Jewish, and it's ambiguous as to whether he was a believing Jew, like if he was a Jew ethnically or religiously. And it is important to make that distinction. I believe he was ethnically, but I believe religiously he may have been closer to an agnostic. Anyway, if you look up Steinitz and you look at his Wikipedia article, you're going to find a lot of mistakes. And I just want to let you know that if you're trying to fact check me using Wikipedia, know that the version of Wikipedia that is out there right now is wrong. In fact, in this first sentence on early stages of chess career, there's about 3 mistakes. Maybe I'll fix that one of these days, but just so that you know, the information out there is a little bit wrong, and I'm going to be relying for my lecture on this book, which is McFarland and Company. I've praised them many, many times throughout these lectures. They do the best chess biographies. And this book by Kurt Landsberger, who was born Kurt Steinitz, actually. He is distantly related to William Steinitz. This book is meticulously researched, and even though it was published about 25 years ago now, it is still the authoritative bibliography on Steinitz. And Landsberger also went through the trouble of collecting Steinitz's papers, letters, newspaper articles, that sort of thing. And I used them both for this lecture, and so it's more authoritative than Wikipedia. All right, whoops. So, family, big family, 13 children. And you probably are looking at that and you think, okay, I can't really make that out, so let's break it down. Parents, Anna and Joseph Steinitz. You'll notice that a couple things. Anna Steinitz was fairly young when she started having children, and she died at a fairly early age. She died when young Wolf was, I think, 8 years old, somewhere around that age. No, 11 years old, excuse me. Joseph Steinitz lived quite a while, and he actually got remarried after Anna died and had a child with that second wife, and he was 61 years old when that child was born. So he had children at a late age, and remember that because it's going to come up again. Children. So first we had Edward, Rosalia, Amalia, Johanna, Solomon, Simon, Benedict, Elizabeth. So you see the pattern of birth here, pretty much a year, 2-3 years sometimes. And incidentally, sometimes the records or information you find out there online, they have the wrong birth dates or death dates. These are the death dates and birth dates as best we can determine. There's a lot of information that's missing. We don't know how many of them got married, we don't know of any living descendants of Steinitz except through his half-brother and his biological children or child, which we'll get to. Next comes William, and you'll notice the second Amalia. That suggests the first Amalia may have died at an early age, because you'll note after William, all of his siblings died at a very early age, 3 or 4 years old, less than a year old, 3 years old, 1 year old, or less than a year old. So it was the child mortality rate in the ghettos of Prague in the mid-19th century was quite high, and so it's to be expected that out of the 13, not all of them would reach adulthood. And this goes into some of the controversy. Sometimes William says, I'm the youngest child. He's not, but he is the youngest surviving child, or he's the youngest child to actually reach adulthood. That part is true. But the Wikipedia article says he was the youngest child. He wasn't. Also said that his father was a hardware merchant, hardware retailer. He wasn't. He was a tailor. So there, and also they get his birth date wrong. So there are a lot of mistakes there that we have to correct. That's what we're trying to do. Set the record straight. So William grew up in Prague, and we don't know very much about his early years. The record keeping was scant, and William didn't talk about it very much. And he didn't really have any childhood friends that he kept for a long period of time. He didn't really correspond with anybody from his childhood. He didn't reminisce about his childhood very much. But here's what we think we know. We think that he grew up in Prague, and that at around the age of 12, he probably started to learn chess. Now, there's a couple conflicting theories on how he learned chess. Maybe he learned from his father. Maybe he learned from some friends at school. We're not sure, but one thing we do know is that young William was a scholar of the Talmud, the sacred text of Judaism, and he was considered the best scholar of the Talmud of his age group. We don't think he kept up with that, though. Instead, he moved to Vienna around age 18, maybe age 20, and the records are a little difficult to interpret there, but probably closer to 18. And we don't know that he ever saw his family ever again after that. There were times where he was playing tournaments in Vienna where he could have just taken a quick train ride up to Prague, but we don't know for sure if he ever did that. What we do know is that in Prague in Vienna he worked for a couple of years as a tutor. What was he tutoring? The Talmud? I'm not really sure. German? His first language would be German, and then he also spoke Yiddish. Later on, he'd learn other languages. But we also know he entered a polytechnic school where he studied math, and he was kicked out after 2 years for failing to show up for his exams. Probably because he spent most of his time playing chess in a cafe in Vienna. Now, Prague didn't have a chess scene really at all. Vienna did have a chess scene, and William certainly took part in it, but he was not the best player there. He didn't win his first chess tournament that we know of until he was 25 years old. There are plenty of world champions who have won the world championship before age 25, right? We know of one right now. So he was, I don't want to say a late bloomer, he was a very, very bright child. In fact, you can see this quote here, he was smarter than pretty much anybody around him in a lot of different ways, but he did not have the opportunity to really study under people in Vienna. The only way he could really learn was by playing, and at that time to play you had to gamble, so they would bet on their games and you had to essentially pay to play, and the winner kept the stakes. So that would become not only his means of supporting himself, well actually it really became his job, and that would stick with him for the rest of his life. At this time he did work a little bit as a journalist. He covered the parliament in Vienna, which is somewhat interesting. Later on, after winning a couple of tournaments, Vienna decided to send him to a tournament in England where he actually got his feet wet, and then he ended up staying in England for about 20 years. But before I get to that, let me tell you a little bit about the chess scene at the time. So in the 1830s, the best chess player in the world was probably Louis Charles de la Bourdonnais. So La Bourdonnais was obviously a French player, and his match record against his best challenger was pretty impressive. He also wrote books on chess, but at this time, he didn't consider himself like world champion. That name or title didn't come about until later when Steinitz popularized it. So he was probably the best player in the world in the 1830s, but it wasn't really a big deal. There weren't a lot of tournaments, people would challenge him to matches, but of course he probably still had a day job. In the 1840s, we have Howard Staunton from England, a pretty imposing person, someone who was known for his temper, for one thing, but he was a good chess player, and he, I don't want to say dominated, but he was the strongest chess player presumably all throughout the 1840s, from the time Le Bourdonnais basically retired until the time actually Staunton really retired. He retired from match and tournament play in the late 1840s, early 1850s, and he was supplanted by a German, Adolf Anderssen. Note the spelling, spelled a little differently than some of us. And Adolf Anderssen was after Staunton retired, even right before he retired, you see in this tournament, in this match play, Staunton finished fourth and Anderssen finished first. So he was probably considered the best chess player in the world in the 1850s until Paul Morphy came along. So Paul Morphy, I did a lecture on him. If you haven't seen it, watch it. But Paul Morphy took Europe by storm. He came in and basically kicked everybody's butt. If you look at those match records, it's not just that he won them. It's not just that he beat several people. It's that he crushed several people. He crushed all the biggest names. Staunton famously didn't play against Morphy in match play ever. And some people argue that he was ducking Morphy. Staunton just says, well, he was retired, so wasn't going to rise to that. But Morphy came along and beat everybody. But Morphy, you may remember, and he's really young at this time, he's undoubtedly the best in the world, though he never claims that title himself. He doesn't care about chess titles. In fact, after about 1861, he doesn't care about chess anymore, stops playing, and I get into the reasons for that in my lecture. Civil War, most notably, family loses their fortune. He loses marriage prospects because nobody wants to marry a chess player, et cetera, et cetera. Downward spiral. I know some of us have experienced that. And then, and then after Morphy leaves and goes back to the U.S., well, it's probably Adolf Anderssen again. There's a big tournament in 1862. Morphy obviously doesn't participate, and Anderssen beats out some pretty strong people, maybe your ancestor there. So Anderssen is probably at this point the best chess player in the world, although Steinitz is the up-and-coming player. Well, I say up-and-coming, he's almost 30 years old at this point, but again, late bloomer. Well, in 1866, Steinitz challenges Anderssen for a match. And this was billed as a world championship match. Now, it's debatable whether it was billed as a world championship match before the match or after the match. But what we can say with certainty is that after Steinitz won, he called himself the world champion. He called himself the world champion in his own articles. He called himself world champion in his correspondence with people. He called himself world champion to anybody who would listen. And he would continue calling himself world champion for 28 years until he lost his title to Lasker, but I don't want to get too far ahead. And you notice in this a little image I found, it was billed as a world championship match in the booklets that were published with all the games and all the annotations. And after this, Steinitz would not lose a single match for, well, essentially 28 years. He would not be beaten in match play. He would fail to win tournaments at times or two. He might finish second or third, or well, really second or third. It didn't really finish lower than that. But he would not lose in match play after this for a long, long time. And we'll see some of those matches we had played, and we'll see the results of those matches and how his career and personal challenges progress from there. But as we always do, let's take a moment to look at a couple of different games. We have quite a few games and positions for you tonight. But as Warren will tell you, at this time, games were often somewhat short. So again, for the analysis, I will turn it over to Warren.
Right. So, unfortunately, kind of like Morphy, Steinitz is neglected a lot by, chess players nowadays. They'll see the games of Fischer or Kasparov, or of course, Carlsen, Kramnik, Anand, a lot of those players, Lasker, Capablanca, but Morphy and Steinitz are neglected quite a bit. Probably Steinitz even more than Morphy, but make no mistake, Steinitz was a really, really strong player. He was no chump. Okay, he was, after all, the best chess player in the world for probably one of the longest periods in history, right? Kasparov was #1 rated for 20 years. I don't think any modern chess player is ever going to beat that. Even Carlsen, I don't think will be able to beat that. But 28 years back then, even though there wasn't the same level of competition, still pretty amazing to be at the top for that long. So first, let's check out his tactical prowess. This guy did not miss tactics. So let's give you some puzzles and see if you can play like Steinitz. Let me flip it around. All right, so black to play here. Steinitz was black. As you might be able to tell from even a cursory glance, black has pretty awesome position, right? Pawn on the 7th rank. All of black's pieces are kind of around white's king. But black has one way that leads to crushing victory, and everything else really actually isn't that crushing, surprisingly. So see if you can find the crushing win for black.
Rook takes G2.
You are correct. So rook G2, but you know, if you see the follow-up, I'll be even more impressed. King has to take, right? Otherwise,
Check.
what's that?
93 check.
93, white can play queen takes.
Followed by Queen H3 check.
Queen H3, King G1, and
And then
suddenly I think white will be winning here. But you were right about rook takes G2, but you have to see the follow-up.
Rook takes G2, King takes G2, Rook F2.
Yeah.
The problem with that, if bishop takes, then it will be good. But white
Yeah.
can play King G1, unfortunately, and there's nothing absolute after that.
Is it knight takes H2? With the idea of bishop to H3?
Nope. When white plays bishop takes, the queen will guard H3 from B3.
Oh, it's true.
So I'll help y'all visualize a little bit and play his first move. See if you can find the killer here.
Knight F2?
Knight F2. I guess the problem is I don't see a particular threat.
Queen H3.
Well, the
and-
king can always go to G1.
Okay.
It's more forcing than that.
More forcing.
Queen H3.
Very nice.
Okay.
So white has a problem.
Oh, I see.
If king takes, the king
Discovery.
can be
Knight
lured
E3,
up.
mate.
But you know, first of all, you should understand that if king G1, then rook F2 is now killer. The threat of mate on G2, and if the bishop takes, then queen H2 followed by mate in F2. So white has no way to defend there.
That's actually mate, yeah.
So the king has to bravely go forward. And now how do we continue?
Knight to E3.
What's that?
93.
Yeah, 93. 93 is the right square, taking G2 away, so the king can't go back. King has to go forward. And now what?
Knight G2.
Very nice. King has to continue marching forward.
being kidnapped.
Rook F5 mate.
Rook F5 is not mate,
Oh, wait.
but it is correct. King goes back to G4.
H5 mate.
H5 is not mate.
Dang it. Look, I need to think for a minute. I apologize.
It is a forced mate in 2, though.
Oh.
H5 and then
H5 is right, and exactly. Very nice. Rook F2 guards the knight on G2, so the white king is all out of squares.
Wow.
Yeah, pretty spectacular mate, right? I don't think that's by any means obvious. So pretty awesome combination. All right, so that was pretty cool. Now let's see how he crushed one of his peers at the time, Bird. So Bird was very strong, by the way. You might even have you heard of his opening. 1F4 is named after him. He didn't have good results with it, by the way, when he did play it. But it is named after him because he was the first to actually seriously play it. But he was a very strong player. By the way, Bird, he's beaten many strong players. He's beaten Lasker. He's beaten Steinitz. He's beaten Steinitz other games. He's beaten.
Blackburn.
Yeah, he's beaten Blackburn,
Maybe
Paulson.
Chigorin. I don't know if he was still active then.
He almost certainly, probably beat Chigorin. Bird was a very strong player. So even though this game did not go well for Bird, make no mistake, Bird was a very strong player. So let's see how it went downhill so fast. All right. So it starts out as a French. Bird plays unknowingly at the time the Rubinstein variation of the French. I say unknowingly because it had not been dubbed the Rubinstein yet, right? I don't even know if Rubinstein had been born by when this game was played, right? I don't think he was
I don't
actually.
think so.
And so, Bird naturally doesn't know how to play the Rubinstein and plays knight f6, which may not seem like it, but it's a mistake already. Now, of course, any dummy nowadays knows that knight d7 is the main move here, so that when you play knight f6, you can take back with the knight. The problem with knight f6 is that when white takes, you have to take it the g-pawn, so you wreck your pawn structure, or take it the queen. But taking with the queen has some disadvantages. Namely, after knight f3, white surprisingly already has serious threats going on. you can probably already guess white's next move is going to be bishop g5, right? So in that spirit, black should have played h6 here, but Bird did not see the danger. Played knight c6. And now Steinitz punishes it. So the queen has to go to f5 or g6, right? One of those squares. And now bishop d3 in any case, and I get a tempo on the queen. Queen g4. This was Bird's last decisive mistake. At this point, Bird had to play something like queen d5 or queen a5 and get the queen off of the king side. Because after queen g4, now white basically wins by force. So see if you can find how Steinitz wins here. So white to play. And you only get credit if you see it before playing the move. Not just guessing here. Okay, queen takes g2.
Rook H2.
Very nice, yeah. And rook h2 instead of rook g1, why?
Queen takes h3.
Because of-
Yeah, exactly. You would hang h3. So, of course, Steinitz sees this. Okay. And yeah, like you said, rook h2, and now Bird's just lost. Played on a couple more moves, but it didn't really matter. Took on d4, and one last little puzzle. White to play. What's the best move here? Of course, pretty much any reasonable move is good, but white has a really strong one.
Yeah, the bishop b5 is kind of
Very nice, Nathan. Yes.
and the knight takes queen d8 checkmate.
Yep. Knight can't take the bishop, and if black doesn't, then white just take the knight. And by the way, c6 doesn't really help because after queen takes, white still threatens mate. So black has no time to take the bishop. So very nice. All right, now let's see a tactic he played against Chigorin. So this game comes from, surprisingly, a Ruy Lopez. I say surprisingly because it's really rare in this opening for white to castle queenside. And in this clearly better position for white because black has this isolated e-pawn and white has this dangerous open h-file, Steinitz came up with a very clever way to get a crushing attack against Chigorin. So white to play. I find Steinitz's move here really imaginative. By the way, there's nothing forcing yet. You may have dreams of sacking on the h-file, but for now, g8 is safe because knight is on e6. So such things don't work yet.
So take the knight first.
Yeah, that's what I said.
So bishop takes e6, and then bishop
Well,
takes e6.
bishop takes e6 would still leave g8 available for the king.
Oh, it would. That's right.
But knight to g5 first.
Yeah, knight g5 may be good, but that would get rid of an attacker. Black could
Okay.
play knight takes g5.
Queen F1.
Very nice. Yeah, I think queen f1 is a really cool move. The idea is that the queen coming into the attack on h1 will be really strong, right? The queen on e2 actually wasn't well placed. It wasn't participating in the attack. But now white's planning a future sacrifice on h7, and the queen can slide over to h1 and be part of the attack. But the knight's still on e6, so of course white's nothing forcing yet. Black played a5, which was a poor move. Black was really being optimistic here.
What was his best move?
Yeah, his best move was, you might guess this from what I've been saying, is h5. May seem surprising to move that pawn in front of your king, looks scary, but surprisingly, white doesn't have anything crushing. If you try something like g4, you drop the knight, so it's not easy to see how white can attack. And white's definitely better, but there's nothing devastating, right? But Chigorin didn't see this and played a5, trying to get his own attack. Well, naturally, right? You want counterplay. But now d4. And so white threatens both d5, forking the queen and the knight, and the e5 pawn. So black doesn't have much choice. He captured on d4. If instead e4, then d5 wins the piece, right? Because after the queen moves, it doesn't really matter where, say b5, then you're threatening the bishop as well. So there's no time for black to win a piece back. And so black captured on d4, but now knight takes. And already black has a problem. Black played bishop takes, which looks really unnatural, right? But you gotta understand why. he did not play knight takes d4. Why did he avoid this?
Rook takes h7.
Very nice.
Wins around the spot.
Yeah, unfortunately it's mate now.
Yeah, no, just checking.
So unfortunately you can't play the natural move knight takes d4. So that's why he played bishop takes. May look really ugly, but that's why. And now how should white continue here?
Take knight h7 anyway?
Oh, take an h7 doesn't work again. The knight on e6 guards the g8 square.
Okay.
Remember, that was the key when black played knight takes to white worked.
So you play rook takes here?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. So that you can keep that bishop to support the queen on, yeah.
And so black has serious problems. Rook d h4, and white doesn't even have to sacrifice a piece to get an attack, right? And so now black played knight takes, which looks ugly because after bishop takes d4, white's pretty much crushing. But that wasn't even Steinitz's choice here.
No.
So white's play can actually just force checkmate. You probably get an idea of what white should do now.
Yeah, it's like on h7.
Yep, rook h7, queen h1.
Yeah.
It's the same mate as earlier.
Not quite.
Not quite.
Bishop h6.
It's okay.
Queen h6 wouldn't quite work, but bishop h6 is the point, because if the king tries to hide, it can't hide, right? Black has to sack one more piece, and then it's just checkmate.
So instead king f3, king f6.
Yeah, the king has to go up, and now how does white force home the mate?
H4.
Very nice. King has to go to e5. King f5, queen f4 would be mate. Now queen takes, and black is probably mated. But anyway, I was really impressed when I saw this queen f1 move. I mean, what a cool move, Just identified the queen wasn't in the attack, and that you need to bring it over to the king side. It's very unnatural since you're moving backwards, but very, very deep idea. But just so you can see it, king f5, queen f4 is mate. All right, and now one more game to demonstrate his tactical prowess. Where did I put it? Here we go. So this game was actually when he was much older. This was played when he was 59. So he was an old geezer here, right? He was playing a guy, this was a tournament, and his opponent was actually leading the tournament. He was crushing everybody. He had 7.5 out of 9. He had already, in that tournament, he had beaten Chigorin, I think. He had beaten a couple really strong players. So this young whippersnapper was doing really well, but Steinitz put him in his place. So let's see how. And by the way, the Italian game, this is what we're seeing a lot in the World Championship match, right? But unlike Carlsen, Steinitz played d4. Now there are reasons why d4 isn't very popular now, and I'll talk about that a little bit. So of course black must take. And after bishop b4, the calm line for white is to play bishop d2. But the reason it's calm is that you're just inviting an exchange of pieces. But Steinitz played the romantic knight c3. Now black did not play the opening very precisely. Of course, everyone and their mother nowadays knows knight takes e4 is the right move. This is the equalizer, and that's pretty much why this line has fallen out of favor. Now there are some tricky lines, which is why some people used to like it. The main line is castles, and then after bishop takes, d5 is the interesting. This has a name actually. I should remember it, but it doesn't. I can't remember it at the moment. But black is doing fine here. It turns out white has compensation for the pawn, but not more. So this would have been best for black, but he chose d5. And now white can take and just castle. So this is kind of the problem for black. So black plays bishop e6. Unfortunately, you can't win a pawn here. Bishop takes and knight takes doesn't work because of queen e1 hitting the knight, and knight takes, b takes doesn't work for a couple of reasons. White can just take on f7, or you can play queen b3 first, both being very dangerous, right? Take, bishop a3, and black's position is very, very dangerous. So he played bishop e6, which is solid, but now bishop g5. And again, a slight mistake from black. Black played bishop e7. It turns out that queen d7 is slightly better. And the problem with bishop e7 basically is that puts a piece on the e-file, unfortunately. Now takes, and knight d5. And black has this unfortunate knight on e7. This is the part about piece being on the e-file that I said is a problem, because now after rook e1, black can't castle. So this is not easy to get around, right? You can't go to either side. So f6 first of all to stop knight or rook e5. And now queen e2. So queen e2 leads to a pretty awesome game, although Kasparov points out, unfortunately, that it's not quite winning. The best move, just for your reference, is queen a4 here. And queen a4 is nice because the idea is to transfer it to b4, where it will attack the knight. You know, for example, c6, and now queen b4 is really good for white. And there's no defense at this point. Queen d7, just rook takes and rook e1, and white wins the queen. But queen e2 is still a pretty good move. Black has to play pretty accurately. So queen d7, this is really the only move. And now rook c1. And now is where black goes wrong. Black plays c6, trying to, you know, eliminate the possibility of white taking on c7. But it turns out that king f7 would have actually been okay for black. Surprisingly, white doesn't have anything here. For example, queen c4, black can just play knight d5. And black can follow up with rook to e8 and exchange some pieces. So white doesn't have anything special here. But he played c6. And this move is not very good. But you have to play imaginatively to punish it. White only has one move that leads to advantage. So white to play, how can white take advantage of black's king in the center here?
Does d5 help?
It does, but why?
Well, the rook's on the c-file already.
True,
The knight can't take, the queen can't take.
yeah, d5 would open up the c-file, but it does one other important thing.
It frees the square for the knight.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, d5 is very strong. So, you know, as Lucas pointed out, knight takes is not possible, and queen takes is mate. So black has to play c takes. I say has to. It does turn out that relatively best at this point would have been king f7. But this doesn't work out well either. White can just take and play rook d1, and white ends up in an endgame up a pawn after queen e6 takes and knight d4. And this is pretty hopeless for black. You know, maybe you could try to draw this somehow. It is a rook endgame, but it's not going to be easy. But this is probably black's last chance. As it was, he played c takes d5. And now the knight moves to the active d4 square. So king f7, there was no way to castle, so you've got to connect your rooks. And now knight e6. This threatens rook c7, followed by moving the knight away, and just taking the knight. So black has little choice but to play a rook to c8. But now, queen g4, threatening mate on g7 and f8. So black doesn't have much way to defend the g-pawn. Now, knight g6 may look natural, but it loses to knight g5 with the discovery on the queen. So black has to play g6, but now knight g5. With the discovery on the queen, black only has one move, king e8. And now white has a beautiful combination. So white to play. What's the crusher here?
Oh, I see.
Again, you should calculate it to the end, though. This is not a one or two move combination.
Just rook takes e7 with
Yeah, that's
rook
what I
to
would
c8
too.
coming up.
Well, rook takes e7, okay, but what if king takes, for example?
It has to be, yeah.
Yeah, king takes, yeah.
Then rook e1 check.
Then rook e1, say king d6.
Queen f4.
Queen b4?
Queen f4 probably works, but yeah, queen b4 turns out to be more accurate.
Yeah.
And then king c7.
King to what square?
Queen b4.
Yeah, queen to b4, and then what did you say then?
And king c7.
The
Rook c1.
Rook c1.
Well, rook c1, king b8.
Queen f4.
Then rook c7.
Ah, dang, no.
Dang. Okay. Yeah, that's why I recommended queen f4 from the beginning, so we couldn't go to the b8 square. So from the beginning, rook takes e7, king takes e7, rook e1, king d6, queen f4.
Oh no! After king c7, then you have rook e7.
Winning the
If the
queen.
rook's on, if the queen's on b4.
Oh, it's true.
Well, rook e7 is good, but you hang the knight, so black plays f takes g, and if you take the queen, black has 2 rooks to the
Okay.
queen.
Queen in game.
Okay.
Are you saying rook takes c8 is better?
No?
No, that's not right either. Okay. Move knight goes back to e6.
Yeah, that's the move. Knight e6. Now king has to go to b8. It's only square.
96.
And now you play queen f4.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now rook c7, and now
Knight takes.
yeah, knight takes c7, queen takes c7, and then you have mate in 1.
Okay. Yeah, knight's being attacked, just move the knight.
And then
That's
rook
not
e8
quite-
is made after that.
Right.
So just to show everyone the variation we're looking at, takes rook e1. Now, by the way, king d8 is a trivial win after takes and knight c5. You know, the discovery on the queen, right? So that's why I didn't really analyze that. And of course, the king can't go to the king side because the queen would hang. So king d6 is the critical move, but now queen b4. Now king c6 is nothing special. Rook c1 is just mate. So king c7 is the only reasonable move.
And then knight to e6.
And like I was saying, rook e7, you lose the knight.
Right.
So knight e6, king b8, queen f4. And if black takes back the knight, it's checkmate.
Yeah.
It's a very cool line. But it turns out black doesn't even have to take the rook. He can play king f8.
What if,
I hope you calculated this move.
I didn't calculate this move because you just.
So now white has a problem. Your queen's hanging.
Oh, it's the back rank mate.
Your rook on c1's hanging. Your rook on e7's hanging. Your knight on g5 is hanging. And your queen on g4 is hanging.
So rook has
Knight to e6 check.
Knight e6 loses to king takes e7.
Okay.
Oh
Rook
wow.
f7.
Rook c8 check.
Rook f7 is right. So queen takes f7 loses to the same reasons before. White will play rook takes c8, solving the problem with check, right? So king has to go to g8. e8's not possible because queen d7's mate. And now what does white do?
Rook g7.
G7.
Rook g7. Again, queen takes loses the rook takes c8, and king takes loses the queen d7 with check.
Okay, so king back to
So
f8.
king has to go to h8. By the way, king f8 doesn't work because of knight h7, and the king has to move up, take the rook, or yeah, the rook, and now queen d7 is check.
Yeah.
So king has to go to h8, and now what?
Rook takes h7.
Rook h7, yes.
so earlier instead of taking with the king earlier from king e7, queen e7 would have worked either?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I did not mention that. I should have though. So the main point of white's sacrifice is that if queen takes, then rook takes c8 wins a piece.
Oh yeah, that's true.
Takes,
Just up a knight in the
takes,
endgame.
and then white's just up a piece, right?
Queen
You can
blocks
just go into the
trade.
endgame or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's why king f8 was forced, but white has these checks and rook h7. And again, can't play queen takes because of rook c8. And at this point, apparently, Steinitz' opponent just didn't say anything, just stood up and just walked out of the room. Apparently, Steinitz later got a note in the mail that he resigned.
That's a true story that actually happened?
Apparently, it's according to Kasparov. I don't know what his sources are.
Oh, that's crazy. Oh, wow.
Yeah, I'm for some analysis and notes on the tournament situation, everything. I'm using my great predecessors, Mike Kasparov. Now, apparently, Steinitz then demonstrated to the spectators what he would have done if he didn't just leave. So, if king g8, now white can play rook g7. Again, the same problem. But if we go to h8, now queen h4, queen h7, queen h8, queen g7. And a very pretty situation. King d6 loses to queen f6, so king has to go back. But now queen f8, knight f7, and queen d6 with this beautiful mate.
The epaulette mate.
Yeah, very beautiful epaulette. And so this was one beautiful game. So if you don't think Steinitz was a strong player, I think this game is an excellent refutation. And by the way, he was 59 years old when he played this masterpiece. So what a beautiful game. One of my favorites by him. And really, he played almost in a perfect game. Maybe in the opening you can criticize a one move queen e2 instead of queen a4, but that's about the only thing you can criticize that game for. So Steinitz was one strong tactical player.
So 1866, he beats Anderson in match play, and after that, he proclaims himself world champion. And this title, to be forthcoming, has not existed before Steinitz makes it his title. He says, I am the world champion. And everybody was just like, okay, I guess so. And maybe it was considered, maybe some people considered it poor form, but they all agreed that by beating Anderson, and with Morphy, retired officially, that Steinitz was accurate and that he was indeed the world champion. And you can see William Winter, famous chess historian and a strong player in his own right, acknowledges that. And Lasker also talks about it a bit. So afterward, obviously, there was great interest in Steinitz playing other matches. But before we get to that, I thought it might be interesting to talk a little bit about the wages, how tournament purses worked at this time. We know how it works now. You have FIDE, who sells their broadcast rights to a company they pretty much own themselves, and it's kind of really shady. But anyway, somehow they magically get some money. Kherson Yomazov conjures it from his bank account and finances a world championship match, and the winner gets the majority of the money. The loser gets a substantial amount of money too. Back then, that's not how this worked. You had to finance your own chess matches, and typically you did that through financial backers. You had bankers back you up, and they were essentially gambling on you. They were supporting you. They were, financing your match participation, but they were also gambling. So the winner of the Anderson-Steinitz match won 100 pounds, which nowadays isn't worth much. Haha, Brexit. But back then it was a lot of money. It was about equivalent to 2 years of wages for an average worker employed full time. To explain the monetary policy, because you're going to need to understand it later on, there were shillings. There were 20 shillings to the pound, and a whole chicken cost about 2 shillings. So this is about 1,000 chickens, if you want to think of it that way. All right? If you want to, obviously, we can't account for inflation or scarcity or all that sort of thing, but this was a lot of money. You could eat chicken every day, feed your family chicken every day for 2 years and still have plenty of money left over for rent. And this is at a time where most people couldn't really afford to eat meat more than about twice a week. They subsisted a lot on bread, potatoes, that sort of thing. So this was quite a bit of money. After this, what happened is Steinitz went to called a divan, which is a fancy name for a couch, at a place called Simpson's in the Strand. And there's a picture here of Simpson's in the Strand. Present day, it's a restaurant now. There's no longer a chess club there, but they still have some chess memorabilia from when it was a chess club. And it was a very famous chess club in Victorian era England. A lot of the famous players of the time would go play there, like Steinitz, Zukertort, Blackburn, Bird, Bowden, McDonald, a lot of players you've heard about in other contexts. And the way it would work there is you'd play for 1 shilling per game. It's essentially like Washington Square Park in New York, where you pay the hustlers to play and whoever wins gets the money, right? So they would set up shop there and people would just come play them. And sometimes, somebody come pay you 1 shilling for a game and you'd play and you'd just beat them 10 times in a row, but it'd be an educational experience for them, hopefully. And that's what Steinitz did for years and years and years. In fact, he stayed in England for about 20 years, and he spent a lot of that time at Simpson's in the Strand, playing tons and tons of games, including casual offhand games against the best players of the time, people that he would later play in match play. And this is primarily how he derived his income. So that and tournament and match winnings. He did play a couple of tournaments in between winning the World Championship in 1867. He played in Paris. They had an exposition there. Napoleon III wanted to make this big deal about it. Napoleon III would not be in charge much longer because the Franco-Prussian War is coming, but I digress. They had a nice exposition there and a chess tournament. Steinitz finished third. Steinitz was not the strongest tournament player. In fact, he was a really amazing match player. Tournaments not so good. A couple different reasons for that. He he worked really well when he could prepare against one person. He worked very, very hard. But obviously it's hard to prepare against, when you're doing a round robin against 12 other players, it's a lot harder to do that than preparing against one person. And he was also a slow starter in tournaments, and we've seen that with Karras and plenty of other players. So he started a little slow, but he usually picked up steam as the tournament went on. But sometimes he won, sometimes he didn't, but it wasn't really a big deal to him. So he played in that tournament, and I've got the portraits of the people who finished in the top 5. Steinitz is in the middle. Interestingly enough, the guy who won, Ignaz von Kolisch, he became a banker, and a very, very wealthy banker, because he had the support of the Rothschild family. If you know anything about Prussia, you'll know that they were the rulers of the Habsburg dynasty, and one of the Rothschild heirs was smitten with chess, and he got Kolisch, or von Kolisch, hooked up into banking, and later on he'd become a baron and become a chess organizer in his own right. Steinitz didn't have that same ambition. He didn't want to become a banker. He didn't want to become a physician. He wanted to play chess, and that's what he devoted his life to. And so he never, ever became wealthy, although there were times that he was well off. And there were times that he was pretty close to destitute. So 1867 doesn't win, but not a big deal in his book. Again, he sees the tournaments as a way to figure out, who's going to play in match play. Baden-Baden, 1870. Baden-Baden, you've heard that name, it's in Germany. It's notable for 2 real reasons. This is the first year they had the tournament at Baden-Baden. They had many tournaments there throughout the years, including all the way up to really the outbreak of World War I. It was a spa, and this was the era of when spas would start hosting tournaments as a tourist attraction. The one you may have heard a little bit more about would be Cambridge Springs. Same idea. Host a tournament, a chess tournament, bring in a bunch of people, get backing through a bunch of investors, and then it's going to be good for tourism. And it was, because while these chess players are playing, they attract a lot of journalists. There are a lot of journalists who are writing about it, and they're participating in spa treatments, and they're writing about how wonderful the venue is and how great a time they're having, and it creates essentially free marketing for the tournaments. And at this tournament, Steinitz again doesn't win, but comes very close, finishes just half a point behind Anderson, who is up there in age at this point, but still strong. And people are wondering, who Steinitz is going to play and defend his championship again next, but matches haven't really materialized because of financial backing. So more tournaments. Vienna. Now, Steinitz, spent a lot of his young adult life in Vienna. From about 18 to about 28 or so, he lived in Vienna. And so he goes back to Vienna and plays in a tournament there. Hometown kind of advantage, and obviously he's back into a German-speaking country. I should mention, Steinitz did speak English. He went to England, and he didn't speak much English at all, and it was a source of frustration for him. So he said, give me 4 weeks, story goes, and he locks himself up for 4 weeks. Nobody sees him for 4 weeks, and he comes out speaking pretty good English. And actually, there's probably some truth to that. He was a really smart guy. I'm sure he picked up languages pretty quickly. Now, he did retain a strong German accent, and that was the source of ridicule in the press, but I'll get to that later. But he goes back to Vienna, and he ties Blackburn, and then in the playoff, he wins the playoff. This was also the first time Steinitz started or attempted to play a new style, and that style was more of a positional style. Steinitz would later on go on to call this the modern school of chess, as opposed to the romantic school of chess. This mirrored some literary movements of the time. Romanticism was a literary movement in the early 1800s in France and in Germany and a couple of other countries, and it was, the poetry was nature and all about how I'm so special and this, that, and the other. And that transitioned into realism, which was basically trying to create a perfect reflection of what society is and spend 5 pages describing the furnishings of a living room. I still hate you, Balzac. And then after that, it transitioned to naturalism. Naturalism was a scientific response to realism. Naturalism was like Émile Zola, who said, let's give these people these conditions, let's plunk them down, and then let's treat it like a lab experiment and write about what happened. So it's about how, alcoholism could be transmitted, from one generation to the next, and how certain eyebrows could predispose you to murder. And anyway, it was an attempt at scientifically classifying literature. And Steinitz's approach to chess was also quite scientific. He developed a positional style of chess, and you should know a couple things about Steinitz. One, he played very slowly, constantly. His whole life he was criticized for playing very slowly. If there's a story that he played this match against Chigorin, and it was a telegraph match, and then he played another game a couple of years later, and the first 12 moves or something followed the exact line of Chigorin. But even on those 12 moves, he spent over an hour just on those 12 moves, and people are like, why is he spending an hour on moves he's already played? And he liked to take his time. He was very deliberate. And that drove some people crazy, because sometimes the games might last 8 or 10 hours, and they would be his opponents would be exhausted, and Steinitz kind of used that to his advantage. Incidentally, while we're talking about Steinitz, we've talked about Carlsen's orange juice, we've talked about Botvinnik's coffee. Anybody know what Steinitz's drink of choice was?
Tea?
No.
Whiskey?
Good guess. During the match, Steinitz would drink port wine mixed with orange juice. So he was drinking alcohol pretty much the whole time. And after he won or lost, he would celebrate with some beer. Yeah. This differs a little bit. I don't think you're going to see Carlsen, drinking alcohol during his match against Karyakin or vice versa. Anyway, this was the sortie, or the debut of his modern style, and the critics hated it. They liked the swashbuckling romanticism, the attack, attack, attack. And they always assumed that if you were on defense, it's because you were just prolonging your loss. Well, what Steinitz would do is he would lure people into speculative attacks. He would tenaciously defend, and then their opponent would find their initiative blown and their material down, and then Steinitz would steamroll them. Henry Bird, who Warren has already discussed, had a lot of criticism for Steinitz in his approach. The champion wriggler of the known universe. And part of this is because nobody really understood what Steinitz was doing. There's anecdotes where he would play consultation games. You'd have two people consulting with one another, or you'd have team chess, like a group of people consulting. And if you ever had like a team consulting with Steinitz, and if the longer the match went on, the more people would drop off and quit because they just couldn't understand what he was trying to do. But just because they couldn't understand what he was trying to do doesn't mean it didn't work. The proof is in the proverbial pudding, and he was winning. Oh, also this caricature was from a newspaper that kind of started a 19th century flame war with Steinitz. But the caricature has quite a bit of grain of truth to it. Steinitz was known for hunching over the board. Sometimes he'd hunch over so much that his beard would kind of obscure the back two ranks. So people were like, where are your pieces? And oh yeah. And he was also nearsighted. So when he wasn't wearing glasses, he would really squint. He'd really get down close and squint at the board. And when he was doing simul's, he'd walk over your table and he'd squint down over your board, Anyway, mannerisms. He defended his world championship title a couple times in matches, first versus Zukertort, who would become an outspoken critic of his, and then against Blackburn. There's kind of a complicated relationship among these players because they see each other all the time. I told you that Zukertort frequented the same Simpsons in the Strand club to play chess that Steinitz did, and so did Blackburn. And they ran into each other a lot, and they had quite a history. And sometimes that history was fine, sometimes it was not so fine. Like Blackburn and Steinitz got in a fight once, and supposedly Steinitz bashed Blackburn's head into a pane of glass, breaking the glass, or maybe it was vice versa. There's really... Blackburn was prone to drinking a lot and got violent, gave Steinitz a black eye, apparently. There was a lot of history between these players. Zukertort and Steinitz got into this feud in the press, like with conflicting editorials against one another, and it lasted years. So they played each other a lot. They had quite a history, but when they got down to match play, Steinitz, at least in the 70s, crushed them. 7-0ing Blackburn, keeping Zukertort to one win, while he had 7. He outclassed his play. In fact, out of these 19 games, he lost one of them. That's pretty dominant. And this started a streak, actually, where he won 25 straight games in a row. A feat that I don't know if that's been beaten today. in top-level play. That'd be interesting to know if anybody has outdone him. There have been unbeaten streaks that have gone on longer. Fischer had a really long winning streak of 20 or 21 games in the early 70s, but I don't know that anybody has beaten that streak. So Steinitz was far and above his competitors, at least in the 70s. And after this, from 76 to 1882, Steinitz takes a hiatus. He takes a break from match play, doesn't even play any tournaments. Instead, what he does is he goes back to being a journalist. He writes newspaper articles for magazine articles for a sports magazine called The Field, which still exists to this day, actually. Time bought them out a couple years back, but they still exist. They still publish. Small circulation. But back then, Steinitz was the editor of the chess section, essentially. And he used that to discuss tournaments that were ongoing, matches that were being played, and also to take aim at some of his opponents and some of his critics. He got into, like I said, some spats. He also had some problems with his health during this time. He reported that he had a sunstroke in 1867. I know what a sunstroke is, but I don't really understand if that's what he actually had, because he talks about the effects lingering for weeks or months on end and slowly improving, and I've not heard of that happening. I wonder if it was an actual stroke. You know, I don't know, but there's not been any analysis of his symptoms and medical opinion there. But he stopped playing for a while. He also got married. Well, I say he got married. It's not really clear that he got married. He fathered a child. Let's put it that way. His daughter Flora Steinitz was born in August of 1866, right around the time that he's playing his World Championship match, incidentally. And Steinitz is in a relationship with a woman named Caroline Golder is her maiden name, but she takes on Steinitz. She's buried as Caroline Steinitz. But there's no evidence that they were actually married. They were together for 28 years. They had a daughter together, but we don't know hardly anything of her. The one time that she's asked to sign her name on something, she puts a mark. So it's speculated in the book that maybe she was illiterate. Anyway, Steinitz never talks about her. We don't have any letters that he may have sent her, and we don't even know if she was capable of reading or responding back. But we do know that he spent a lot of time away from home. But during this time, this 1886 through 1876 to 1882 time period, he did spend quite a bit of time raising his daughter. He was close to his daughter Flora. Unfortunately, his daughter Flora died in 1888 at the age of 21. Remember, mortality. She died of endocarditis, they said, which is kind of vague. She may have had a heart murmur or something, who knows. What else is he doing? Well, he's teaching chess. He is not just playing people for 1 shilling a game, but he's tutoring. One of his students, Lord Randolph Churchill, whose son is?
Winston Churchill?
Winston Churchill, yes indeed. He is tutoring the father of Winston Churchill, who is a parliamentarian, who's in the House of Lords. And he is coaching him in openings and playing a lot at his house or his mansion, I should say. And this for Churchill is therapeutic. You know, this is time away from thinking about politics. And there's no, the evidence is that they maintain a cordial relationship. It's just that Lord Churchill got even more busy with Parliament and he had to cut out his chess lessons. But Steinitz took on other students. Steinitz had a lot of affluent friends and acquaintances, a lot of influential acquaintances, but he never used them, ever. Never asked for money, never asked for favors, wanted to do everything his own way. One of Steinitz's most predominant personality traits is that he was stubborn, very, very stubborn. Stubborn on the chessboard, which served him very well. Stubborn in asking for help, and that, among other things, would lead to him spending most of his life, scraping and scrambling to make enough money to make ends meet and support his family. Incidentally, in 1885, Lord Randolph Churchill was vice president of the British Chess Association. The president was Alfred Lord Tennyson, who you may know from literature. So it was quite a time in Victorian England for chess, and the ties between chess and aristocracy were numerous. So Alfred Lord Tennyson president, Lord Randolph Churchill vice president. Not bad. But around this time, 1876 and onward, this is when we start getting into that spat between various magazines. So the Westminster Papers is edited by a guy named Hoffner and also gets regular contributions from Zuckertort. And they go on a, I don't want to say a campaign, but they fire some shots at Steinitz. And Steinitz fires back. And this begins what is called an ink war. That's what they call it. And this is, to a large extent, the reason that Steinitz is still not very well known and still has somewhat of a poor reputation to this day. Because of the ink war, and because he was a foreigner, and they never let that down in England. They never really accepted him as one of their own because he was a foreigner, and because he was a Jew. For all those reasons, Steinitz was never part of the in crowd, and he was always somewhat marginalized, and he was a target for abuse of various kinds. And I don't want to say that Steinitz didn't fire back. He did. He gave as good as he got, but it took its toll. In later years, this rivalry between Hoffer, the editor of the Westminster Papers, and Steinitz, the editor of the Field, would last like 20 years, even after Steinitz had moved across the Atlantic. And it got to the point where Steinitz didn't call him Hoffer anymore. He called him Drexel, which I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right in German, but Landsberger in his book translates it as shithead. So that's how he refers to him for the rest of his life. And he openly publishes that in newspapers. Well, you know, shithead, you're wrong. Anyway. So there goes the PG rating of this broadcast, sorry. And so Steinitz called these people inky ruffians. And this made it very difficult to arrange matches. Zuckertort is considered to be the strongest player after Steinitz, and everybody's saying, hey, you should play Zuckertort. You should come out of your hiatus and play Zuckertort in a match. And so he proposes terms. And Zuckertort's like, well, first you have to apologize. And Steinitz is like, no, I'm not going to apologize. So it never happened. And then Steinitz uses the nuclear option. He says, okay, if you're so smart about chess, I challenge you. You two can consult. And I'll play you. We'll play for 100 pounds. And Zuckertort says, you still have to apologize. And so Steinitz wanted to settle it over the board, and Zuckertort, probably wisely, hid behind protocol. Maybe you want to call it the moral high ground. But what I will tell you that this did is it probably drove periodical sales. Now that's cynical, but controversy sells papers. And you may remember from the era of yellow journalism a little later on with like the William Randolph Hearsts and the Pulitzers of the world that they engaged in this kind of simmering feud that would last decades, and that would drive a lot of print sales. And so I'm sure their owners of the paper were secretly kind of happy about all this. Didn't do wonders for the chess community, but it probably made some people a lot of money. Well, Steinitz did come out of his hiatus in 1882. He decided to play again in Vienna. Part of this was because Zuckertort had disparaged him in news media, and Steinitz was anxious to show that he was still the best player in the world. Well, he tied Winnower for the title, and they played a playoff game they played 4 playoff games, and I think those were also tied. I think it was like 1 win, 1 loss, 2 draws, or maybe 2 games, 1 win, 1 loss. But they tied the playoffs, so they shared first place. Steinitz was ahead on tie breaks, but that's not a big deal. But the point is, he finished ahead of Zuckertort, so at least he's got that going for him. And ahead of Blackburn, and against an up-and-coming James Mason, who we haven't heard much about, but was an Irish hopeful. But he ran into the same problem Steinitz did, the fact that he was Irish and not British. Okay, so Steinitz at this point has ensconced himself as he's not the patriarch, he's not Botvinnik, but he's established himself as the strongest player in the world, and he's defended that title in a myriad of different ways, a couple different matches, a couple tournaments, strong, consistent showings. And he has also talked a lot about, he's written a lot about chess, and he's advanced his theories about the modern school of chess. So to learn more about the modern school of chess, let's look at a couple more games from Steinitz. And again, I'll turn that over to Warren.
Yeah, as Lucas was talking about, Steinitz's stubbornness really came through in his chess. You'll especially see it in his game against Chigorin. But since he was just talking about Zukertort, why don't we look at one of his crushing victories against him? And by the way, I'm surprised Zukertort ever talked trash against Steinitz because I never looked at the record exactly, but given all the match play where Steinitz did dominate him, his record must have been pretty poor. And this game we're going to look at was just one of those victories. All right, so this game is more or less just a miniature, and oh yeah, I'm sorry. All right, and really it came down to Zukertort violating some basic chess principles that nowadays we hold to be basic anyway. So let's see what Zukertort did wrong. So the opening, Queen's Gambit decline. So far, nothing wrong. These are all moves I'm sure you've all seen before. So far, White has done nothing wrong. Steinitz castles. So this is all pretty standard even today. But now, Zukertort plays c5, which is not a good move. Besides, the general rule of not relieving the tension so early like that, this move is just in principle wrong. Number one, White doesn't develop the piece in the opening, right? If you think about your simple principles in the opening, right? You want to get your king castle, you want to develop your pieces, you want to control the center. This move does none of those things, right? So in a very basic sense, it's not principled. Now, Zukertort presumably maybe was trying to play against bishop on e7, but this turns out to be pretty much an illusion. So let's see how Steinitz plays. b6. Now this move is really principled, just trying to undermine White's pawn structure. Now if White were to take on b6, Black would play a takes b, and now Black's central control is much greater. It exchanged off White's c pawn for his a pawn, right? Those pawns don't have nearly the same kind of value. So of course White can't afford to do that. Got to reinforce the pawn with b4. But now b takes, and Zukertort made another mistake here, by the way. But the point of Black exchanging on c5, by the way, was to be able to play bishop a6. And this is a problem for White, because now if you develop naturally with a move like e3, Black takes on f1 and you can't castle. Not the end of the world, but Black is certainly not going to have any problems in that position. And by the way, taking on c5 was necessary because if you play bishop a6 here, b5 would be a rude awakening, right? And in fact, the tables would completely turn, because now if you play bishop c8, this knight will be forever entombed, right? Don't want to do that. So he took, but Zukertort, I guess, didn't want to deal with bishop a6, so he played d takes. So now he can again play b5 against bishop a6, but he overlooked some strong moves. So first, a5. Very principled move again, trying to undermine White's pawn structure on the queen side. a3 is the only reasonable move to maintain control over c5. But now Black has a very strong move. See if you can find how Steinitz played.
Knight c6 looks nice.
Knight a6.
Knight c6, I think White would play b5. And
Oh.
I think your knight's going to be entombed again.
Yeah, you're right.
Knight to a6. If he plays b5, we can take on c5.
True, but knight a6, White can play rook b1, and it's kind of under control.
Takes. Then you can play rook to b8. You can kind of fight a little bit for that.
Oh yes, you're right, but it's not as energetic as Steinitz's reply here.
Okay.
So Steinitz played this really active move d4.
Interesting.
Now, Black can get away with this because of this threat of taking on b4 and taking on a1. So it turns out White's control over d4 is not as great as it seems. If White plays knight takes d4, then a takes b4, and White's in some serious trouble because you can't take back the pawn because the knight on d4 would hang. So d4 is a big problem, and of course queen takes is bad for a similar reason. Black just takes and plays a takes b and wins at least a pawn, right? Can't take back, and both c5 and a3 are hanging, right? So White has a problem. White would like to take an f6, probably best so that he at least gets the e4 square. Steinitz plays g takes. It may seem counterintuitive, but the point is that if bishop takes, White would play knight e4. And now taking a d4 would be possible. For example, bishop e7, knight takes, and the queen would guard the knight from a1. So the same tactic of taking does no longer work. All right. So g takes f6 was a very prudent move, making sure that black keeps as much time as possible. And now knight a4, maybe knight b5 could have been a little bit better idea, although black still has a good position after something like knight c6 or e5. Black is still very happy. But knight a4 puts knight on the edge of the board. Now e5, defending the pawn. And white's just in a tough spot. b5, probably not the best idea. e3 might have been relatively better. So black just gets simple development. Now rook b8 threatens bishop b3, forking the queen and knight. Queen c1 moving out of it, but now d3. And now white has a big problem, because if white takes, then the queen would take and he would build a castle. So e3, but now black just gains even more space with e4.
Yeah.
And even though white's finally able to castle, not a very good situation. Just rook e8, just slowly improving his position. It's very useful to have the rook here, as you'll see, because he was intending on or expecting white's f3. This is really white's only hope, because otherwise your bishop is completely locked out of the game and you have no counterplay, right? But after f3, Steinitz finds a pretty spectacular reply.
Knight d4.
Very nice, yeah. So black threatens knight e2 check, or maybe knight c2. So white really has no choice but to take it.
Right.
But now queen takes, and
With check, yeah.
although queen a4 would have been perfectly good, e3 is even better, right?
Yeah.
And d4 really wasn't contributing much, so black keeps his really dangerous pair of pawns in the center. So white saves one knight, but black doesn't care. Simply bishop f6. White doesn't have many places he can go. White's trying to simplify, but now e2.
That's just me.
Goodness gracious.
And now the problem for white, after queen c3, material's even relatively, but black forks the rooks on f1 and d1. So no matter what white does, black can up a rook. But really, I think this game is just, so instructive, right? White made one, mistake in the opening, not following principles, and just got punished, just smacked down. So, just really illustrative game. I mean, Steinitz showed you exactly the reasons why it's bad. Developed quickly, got a lot of space, all because of white's c5 move. All right. Now let's check out another game. This was against someone who wasn't one of the strongest players of the time, but still a really very illustrative game. And this variation is actually named after him, by the way. E5 is known as the Steinitz variation, right? Followed by f4. Now Kasparov has some pretty brilliant games, Anand as well as white in this line. So topical even now. And now white's whole idea here is that instead of keeping a pawn on d4, he's willing to give it up and get a knight there instead. Right, before Steinitz, everyone had previously played knight ce2 with the idea of playing c3, right? Much like the advanced variation, trying to support the pawn center that way. So Steinitz's idea with playing f4 was rather different and really strong, by the way. Now c5 takes. White doesn't have to take this early. He can play knight f3, but d takes c5 isn't bad. Now a6, black kind of starts to lose time. Black could have just castled to play knight c6. a6 is kind of a waste of time in this position. It's just simply not necessary. And black really starts to go wrong here. Knight b4 is just way too slow. Now, black does have to be careful, by the way. White would be very happy to see black castle, because you have this classic Greek gift sacrifice here, right? If you've read The Art of Attack in chess, you would automatically think of that, right? But black doesn't have to do that either. Black can play a move like b5, continue development, gaining space on the queen side. But knight b4 is a wrong idea because black loses control over the d4 square, which is a very, very important square, especially in this Steinitz variation. So white just continues developing. Now, Kasparov kind of criticizes knight d1 a little bit, saying that he should have left it there so he can bring it to e2 and d4 later, a little bit more direct. But I think knight d1 is definitely fine. And now knight d3, probably still going the wrong way. You know, black probably still could have retrieved the knight and keep control over d4. And now c takes. See, this is an important moment, by the way. You know, Kasparov just kind of arrogantly says, you know, any candidate master now just plays c takes automatically, but he doesn't really explain why.
Well, my only concern with that would be what if black were to do d4 to make rendering d3 a backwards pawn?
Well, backwards pawns, generally speaking, aren't really a problem if they're not on a half-open file. So, I mean, theoretically speaking, d3 wouldn't be considered a backwards pawn, right?
They wouldn't be able to push it up to connect with the other two.
Well, true, but e5 is, I don't think, a big weakness for white. The problem with d4, by the way, is you give up control over e4. White could play knight f2, followed by knight e4. But anyway, you know, the reason white wants to play c takes here instead of queen takes is very simple. You want to control e4, right? Because otherwise, black, if you were to play queen takes d3, black could play bishop b6 with the intention of knight c5 and knight e4, and the knight would be very active.
You want to take the c-pawn.
So c takes is important for the very simple reason that you control e4 with the pawn. So black has no good outpost in the center for his knight, but you have d4 for yours. So that's really the whole point here.
Mm-hmm.
Queen b6, now b4. b4 is very simple if you think of what white's plan is, right? White wants to occupy d4 with the knight, so you should push bishop away from where it attacks d4. So now the white knight arrives on d4, and black really doesn't have any active plan here. Well, it's really fun to see how Steinitz wins.
Why put f5?
Yeah.
That was terrible.
Well,
In the French, you always want to keep the.
in fairness to black, it was difficult to suggest anything else. You know, if we go back here, you know, it's really hard to say what else you should do here. Yeah. You know, the problem with a move like f6 is you weaken d4 anyway. You know, white could play bishop b3, followed by knight d4, all the same, right? But anyway, black unfortunately has to play knight f8. And here black does make a mistake, by the way, playing h5. He was worried about g4, which may have been annoying for him, but at the same time, black just weakens more dark squares. You know, another principal thing Steinitz said, and it's really something to think about in your own games, is, you know, don't move pawns unless there's a very big purpose behind it, a reason, right? Because pawns can never move backwards. You're always making weaknesses. And Steinitz actually uses the weakness of that h4 d8 diagonal later. So maybe if black hadn't played h5, it wouldn't have been quite as easy. So be careful when you move your pawns. You know, have a very good purpose behind them. So knight moves to c3, not so to move it towards the center, but to move it closer to the dark squares, right? So the knight's headed for b3, where it can go to c5, d4, or a5. All pretty awesome squares. So white owns the c file. And black is in a pickle here. Unfortunately, black would love to get rid of this horrible bishop, but it doesn't work out because white threatens the knight, the e6 pawn, and a6. And there's just no way to defend it all, right? If you play knight f8, white just takes a6. So unfortunately, can't take it. But now, white takes your good bishop, and you're left with these horrendous pieces. And this h4 d8 diagonal is what I was talking about. You know, if white wasn't able to get his bishop on that diagonal, it might not have been so easy. And now, at this point, he just resigned. There's no way to defend e6. Right, knight f8, white just takes. and then knight e6 is a fork, right? So really nice squeeze, but Steinitz illustrated some really nice points, controlling the d4 square, and c takes c3, another big point, just controlling e4 with the pawn, right? And it's not rocket science, just principal chess, right? If you think about it more logically, after black took the bishop on d3, queen takes doesn't really improve the position of the queen, but c takes improves the position of the pawn because you control e4, right? So really simple things like that add up, right? Okay. Now, this last game is going to be a bit more interesting, and this has to do with his stubbornness too. Steinitz really didn't have much respect for the Evans Gambit. Now, the Evans Gambit is b4. And oh, I'm sorry, I should flip it. Now, of course, according to principal chess, gambling a pawn for some kind of vague compensation certainly is not principled, right? So Steinitz absolutely loved defending this. I mean, you can find he has over 100 games where he's defending the black side of this. Now, he did lose a lot, by the way, because he played really speculative for some reason. But all in all, he just loved playing the black side here. So c3. And by the way, for the record, Kasparov did beat Anand with the Evans Gambit. Not saying the Evans Gambit's great, but it's not, it's not really that simple, Steinitz thought. So bishop a5. Bishop a5 is almost certainly the best. It avoids being harassed further on c5, and it avoids being passive on e7. By the way, Anand chose bishop e7 against Kasparov, just for your edification. But bishop a5 is probably the best move here. And now castles, and nowadays we know that this is too passive. If you want to play the Evans Gambit, you have to play d4 here. Play as actively as you can. It's important for the reason that knight f6 is no longer very good for black because white can play d5. Problem being, knight e4 loses to queen d5, threatening mate and the knight. And after white castles, queen f6 is not very good, by the way. Don't repeat Steinitz. But knight f6 and black is doing fine. The problem here is after d4, black can just take on e4. Right? If d5, black can castle, and queen d5 does no longer threaten mate. So black's doing okay here. And other moves just aren't that spectacular. d5 would win back the pawn, or at least one of them, but it cuts off the bishop's scope. So knight f6 is the best move there, but he chose his queen f6 move. He wanted to go for this knight e7 setup, but it's not really a good idea. And the problem is his d5 move. And black just has this really awkward position. His bishop on c8 sucks. Knight b5 is threatened. Really tough position. So he plays c6, but this move is really, really ugly. Rook d1. White threatens, d takes c6. Now bishop e7. Now for the record, I would have personally preferred d6, keeping the pair of bishops, right? But I guess Chigorin was happy to see that Steinitz could no longer castle, right? So Steinitz can't be super principled, right? And now d6. And just look at this poor bishop on c8. It's hard to believe, but Steinitz actually manages to win this game. And now Steinitz definitely starts going wrong. His last hope was pretty much bishop c5. Black has to get rid of that d6 pawn. You really cannot tolerate it here. Although white still has a very dangerous position here. But he plays f6, and this really weakens his king. Not a good idea. His hope was that winning the piece back would give him enough, but turns out white's attack is too strong. Simply e5. And now white can give up a piece, but black really doesn't have enough here. Not only does white have ideas with knight c7, but now the queen can join the attack on the king side. But Steinitz defends pretty well. So knight e6, moving the knight closer to the king, helping to defend. Still not good enough, by the way, but it's on the right path. And now we start getting into where Chigorin misses simple wins. He repeated and found the wrong move later, but queen e8 would have been pretty crushing. After king g7, white checks, and now knight e5, and black is basically just dead. If black takes the knight, then rook d3, and this threat of rook g3 is just absolutely deadly. But in the game, he gave a couple checks and went for knight d4 instead, which is still good, but it's not as clear now. Bishop takes, black's able to exchange some pieces, and now rook f8. Now white starts to go wrong again with rook d3. He should have played knight f5 here, followed by queen h6. Although it's not as clear as it was before. It's not quite as good. Now it looks good for white with threats of queen h7, but bishop e4 just squashes everything.
Yeah.
Surprisingly, even though black only has the rook and bishop defending, it's enough. And at this point, white doesn't have enough compensation at all. And Steinitz wraps up. Now, rook takes d6, of course, can't take because of this mate threat on e1. And finally, Chigorin resigned. So, this was an example of, not of Steinitz's best play, but of some of his stubborn play. He was very good at defending, and he loved taking material and just running with it. Even if his position really was bad, he still liked to do it. It was all about the principle to him. If someone offered a free pawn and there's no concrete way for them to get it back, you should just take it. He was really, really skeptical of these gambits like that.
Yeah, one of his most famous quotes was, "The best way to refute a gambit is to accept it."
Mm-hmm. Exactly. That's a perfect summary of his philosophy there. Okay, so any questions here? All right.
After 1882, for a couple of different reasons, Steinitz seemed more amenable to traveling to America to play in the United States for a tour and maybe more. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, I've already mentioned that this was taken in Philadelphia, who invited him to participate in their centennial celebration. One reason is because the press. He was taking a beating in the press. In fact, in the early 1880s, actually when he played in the Vienna tournament in 1883, the Field basically fired him as editor, and they hired Hoffer, remember, our good friend Shithead, in his place, and he felt pretty bad about that. And he felt, I've been here almost 20 years. I've still never really been accepted into society. There's also a couple of flare-ups of anti-Semitism where he really didn't feel welcome. So he started entertaining notions of traveling elsewhere. So he goes to Philadelphia for a prolonged tour. He doesn't take his wife and daughter, interestingly enough. Then he spent a month in New Orleans. This is October 25th, 1882, when he goes over, when he gets on the boat. He gets into Philadelphia in November. He spends half of December and half of January in New Orleans, where incidentally he meets Paul Morphy. There are a couple different versions of the story that goes out, but what Steinitz says is that he visited him 3 times. The first time he saw him on the street, and he gave him his card, and Morphy was quite surprised because he didn't expect, A, someone to recognize him, and B, it being William Steinitz. But apparently Morphy and Steinitz had several conversations, and Steinitz said, quote, "Morphy is a most interesting man to talk to. He is shrewd and practical, and apparently in excellent health. He is the most chivalrous soul alive. He is a thorough gentleman." So they met, per Steinitz, 3 times. Of course, you'd never played chess. You didn't even talk to Morphy about chess. If you talked to Morphy about chess, he would completely shut you down by saying, "I am not a chess player." End of discussion. But you could talk to him about other things. He loved talking about literature. He loved talking about music. He loved talking about other topics. So Steinitz could certainly converse on various topics. But the problem is, whenever they would meet on the street, a crowd would gather around, and Morphy would get kind of annoyed at that, and so it would cut their visit short. But true story, Steinitz did meet Morphy. They never played. who knows, gosh, it's one of those what if things, right? But if Morphy had kept playing, would Steinitz have been world champion? I tend to think at least at first. I think Morphy would have crushed him. Anyway, speculation. So he goes to Philadelphia, goes to New Orleans, and they take pictures of him playing in the New Orleans Chess Club. And it's actually here, we haven't talked about this at all, but it is somewhat interesting to talk about Steinitz's physical description, because he was attacked about this in the press too. There's a couple things you can make out from this photo, and there's a couple things you can't. So I'll fill you in, but I'll read to you a description which appeared. This appeared in the British Chess Magazine. Everything about him denoted power rather than grace, strength rather than beauty. His stature was short, but his form massive, his chest broad, his bearing sturdy. Steinitz's features are rugged in outline, and his face, the face of a man of action rather than a man of thought, the face of a man fitted to lead men in battle rather than that of a philosopher in his study or a scholar in his library, with bright tawny locks, he's a redhead, round face, crushed up nose, I can give no other description of it, broad forehead, deep set eyes, and rough, nay, shaggy beard, also of the bright tawny hue, the whole balanced squarely on a thick neck, that again on a short massive body, and that in turn supported by short legs, with feet firmly planted on the ground. Such was William Steinitz, the William Steinitz I first saw in 1882, and I believe the Steinitz of 1892. So Steinitz was pretty short. He's a little over 5 foot tall. He kept his beard his whole life. He had a very big head, apparently, broad forehead. He walked with a cane. He had a limp. I think it was his right leg. He often has it kind of stiff. And he suffered from arthritis later in life. Anyway, it's why at the chessboard he looks quite a bit smaller than his opponent. So Steinitz did travel back to Europe for London, 1883, where he lost to Zukertort. Well, he lost his, he won one, lost one against Zukertort, so he drew their match, but he lost first place to Zukertort. Selvin's down there, for example. Warren should have game from him earlier. Chigorin is there. Blackburn is there. James Mason again, who is now has an American flag, and Ireland. So there are a lot of strong players at London 1883, and after this, Zukertort starts kind of floating the idea that he's world champion. Because Steinitz beat him like 10 years previous, but look what happened in this tournament. He finished 3 points ahead of Steinitz. So Steinitz immediately challenges him to a match. Zukertort refuses on medical advice, and actually that was really wise. What is not apparent in Zukertort's score is that at one point in the tournament, he was like 21 out of 22 or 20 out of 21. He is basically, his only loss in that whole time was to Steinitz. But the last 3 games, he lost them. He basically collapsed toward the end of the tournament. The author, Landsberger, says he was sustained by drugs, but even that didn't work toward the end of the tournament. Zukertort refused, and Steinitz then kind of lets it go. And later this year, October 14th, 1883 to be exact, he moves officially to the United States with his family this time, and he would later live the rest of his life in the United States, the remaining 17 years or so. That said, he would travel back to Europe from time to time, and I'll get into that. So a match was finally arranged with Zukertort in 1886, and it was closer than their first match, but not really close. It's interesting, though, how this played out, because if you look at the beginning of the tournament, it looks like Zukertort was doing very well, and it was kind of an interesting structure. The way it worked is this. The first few games were played in New York. And when somebody got 4 wins, then it would change venues to another city. They split it between several different cities so they could raise more money for the tournament. It's common practice. All the way through actually the 90s, there were tournaments that are world championship matches in 2 different cities. So the first in New York, Steinitz didn't do very well. After that, the tournament went to St. Louis, and Steinitz won the 3 games necessary to move the match to New Orleans. And then he won, he did very, very well in New Orleans and sealed the deal. But, toward the beginning, it was looking pretty shaky. Zukertort at one point had a 4-win match lead, right? Zuckertort, remember, he almost collapsed at the end of the London tournament, and the same sort of thing kind of happened in this match. After game 19, Steinitz said, quote, "The doctor was certainly in bad form yesterday." Or sorry, the newspaper said this. "The doctor was certainly in bad form yesterday," that's Zuckertort. "This was demonstrated by his face, which was inclined to be haggard, and by his eyes, which were ringed. Steinitz, on the other hand, wore his customary calm and impassive appearance. Nothing ever seems to disturb Steinitz." Incidentally, Zuckertort would die 2 years later in 1888 at the age of 46. When this match was played, Zuckertort was 44, Steinitz was 49. So just because he was younger doesn't mean he had the health benefit. In fact, quite the contrary, and the longer match certainly benefited Steinitz. This isn't the first time this has happened. It's not the last time it will happen. This age and endurance will factor a lot the future after Steinitz. You may remember in the Soviet School of Chess, exercise was a very important element. Steinitz really couldn't exercise as much as he would have liked because of his knee and his arthritis in his knee. However, Steinitz was extremely stubborn, and even in simul's, even when he had a cane or even when he had crutches, and even when the simul's would last 6 hours, he would spend 6 hours on his feet, walking, hobbling from board to board, and he would not sit down ever. So he certainly had the willpower to compensate for it. After Zuckertort dies, they start looking for more challengers, and the next challenger is Chigorin. We've mentioned Chigorin. This was in Havana, Cuba. And we know about Capablanca, did the lecture on Capablanca. You know Havana became a chess center, but it actually started becoming a chess center in the late 19th century, and I probably should explain why. A lot of people don't know this, but around 1900 and in the beginning of the 20th century, Cuba had the second best economy in the Western Hemisphere. Most people don't know that. They think, oh, Canada, Brazil. No, Cuba had the second best economy in the Western Hemisphere until the revolution. And so there were a lot of wealthy financiers there that could sponsor a match. They had a very nice chess club in Havana, and they paid the travel expenses for both Chigorin and Steinitz to come and play this match, and offered them both a fee to play, and then of course extra money to the winner. And Steinitz really billed this as a contest between a young practitioner of the old school of chess, that'd be Chigorin, and an old practitioner of the new school of chess himself. So this is not just him wanting to win for his own personal glory, but it's also to prove he's right about chess. He really, really needs to feel vindicated and to prove that he's right. And in fact, a rising star in the chess scene around this time is Tarrasch, Siegbert Tarrasch, the German. And Steinitz talks in glowing terms about Tarrasch and says Tarrasch was probably going to beat me one day, notably because Tarrasch employed the style and perpetuated the style that Steinitz advanced, or founded, if you want to give him credit for that. Later on, Steinitz played Günzburg in a title match in New York. Günzburg is actually an interesting story. In the late 1800s, there was this whole fad with chess automatons, chess playing machines. But they weren't actually chess playing machines. There was actually a chess player hiding inside. And Günzburg was one of the people who would commonly hide inside one of these chess playing machines and beat everybody who showed up. And it was like, wow, this machine is amazing. And it was just Günzburg inside controlling it. Steinitz probably could have too. You know, he's small enough, but maybe the arthritis and maybe his dignity wouldn't allow him to. There were several different machines floating out there. And yeah, basically they were in these exhibit halls, and of course you couldn't leave the machine inside of anybody because then you'd give away the goose. So they basically worked in these machines as jobs. They would go in, you know, early in the morning, play all the comers, and then leave when nobody was looking. And Günzburg was one of the prominent chess players who did that in his youth. Steinitz beats Günzburg pretty handily. After this, we get Chigorin again, and this match is closer. But Steinitz is the better player. And Steinitz, incidentally, had to go through a lot of personal issues around this time. His daughter has died just like 2 years previously, and he's still kind of mourning from that. And his wife, or maybe his wife, who knows if they were actually married, is going to die a couple of weeks, or actually 2 months after this match, of hepatitis, apparently. The International Chess Magazine, which Steinitz founded and which he wrote in, it was kind of the successor to the Field, which was no longer welcome to publish for, so he started his own magazine. And he says it was a close race all along and almost a toss-up to the last who would win. Perhaps I may rest satisfied by my score on the principle that if one cannot have what he likes, he must like what he has. Yet I beg leave to say that if Chigorin, who so nearly got the best of me, had really defeated me in this contest, he might have beaten my name, but hardly my game, as I played it in former years. This implies no denial of the great genius of the Russian master, which is of the highest order, and it only queried my powers of representing still in actual play and outside of theoretical research the, quote, modern school as opposed to the, quote, old style, to which, according to many of his admirers, Chigorin is considered to stand pledged almost exclusively. So again, this is not just about Steinitz winning and retaining his World Chess Championship. At this point, he's been champion for 20 some odd years. This is really about vindication of his theories. So let's look at our last few games and see how Steinitz's theories were ahead of his time. And again, I'll turn that over to Warren.
So first, we're going to look at this game with Anderson. And what's really interesting about this game is he was almost a century ahead of his time, and you'll see what I mean later. But it really came down to chess, principles that I was talking about earlier. So let's see what happened. So it starts out as a calm Berlin, and I say that because it's surprising what it turns into. And White plays this bishop takes c6 move. It turns out this move is not a good idea. And White's not losing, by the way, but probably giving up an advantage. And again, it has to do with chess principles, right? In the opening, I said before, we want to get castle, develop pieces, control the center. Really, this move isn't doing any of those things, right? And as a second rule of thumb, and I like to tell people this a lot, if you give up your bishop in the opening, you want to get a concession, i.e. time or pawn structure, right? In this case, White does damage Black's pawn structure, but gains no time, right? If Black were to play a6, then bishop takes c6 becomes more reasonable because Black has spent time encouraging you to take the knight. In this case, White only gets one concession pawn structure, and that's not really enough. So just a good rule of thumb to keep in mind. If you're going to give up your bishop for a knight, you better get more than something minor, right? And now White continues to play kind of passively. h3 really is not necessary. It would have been better to just immediately castle and try to open up the center. That would be the only way to try to get anything out of taking on c6. So h3 is kind of slow. And now g6. g6 is a very, very nice move. The bishop will be better placed on g7 than on e7. Be more active. Bishop g5 is also a step in the wrong direction. Again, White should play d4 here, trying to gain space in the center. Because e5 would be difficult, Black would probably be forced to take. After knight takes, at least White has a couple of active knights in the center there. After bishop g5 now, Black just plays h6. Of course, White doesn't want to take the knight and give White two bishops against two knights. They got to play back, but now c5. And this has a benefit of keeping the center closed. And so because Black is closing the center, where is Black going to play? Since the center is closed, you can't play there. What's Black's going to do here? Any ideas?
Attack on the king side?
Exactly, yeah. This position resembles a King's Indian defense, right? And I said Steinitz was like a century ahead of his time because this game was played in 1866. The King's Indian didn't really start to gain steam until that Zurich 1953 candidates tournament. And Steinitz, when you see this game, it's like a masterfully played King's Indian defense. And the way he handles it is really amazing. I mean, I really don't know how he would have known the themes here. It's really astounding to me. But anyway, so rook b1, really logical move. White wants to play b4 and try to open up the center a little bit, which makes a lot of sense. Now knight e8. If you're familiar with the King's Indian, you know, you want to play f5, so you have to move that knight. Now c5, black doesn't want to let white play d4, so you've got to keep clamping down. Now Anderson plays a really risky move, rook a4. It would have been better to play something like rook b2, just control for the b file, because it turns out the rook kind of gets sequestered over there in not really a good way. Okay, yeah, it was lagging a little bit. Lost a couple moves there. So bishop d7, getting a tempo on the rook, and then f5. Your typical King's Indian move. And now queen b1. And now Steinitz was in some angst over it. This was essentially a pawn offer. At this point, black could have taken on e4 and then taken on h3 with the idea that if you take back the bishop, you win the knight. But Steinitz did not want to give up that light squared bishop. It's like he had these visions, you know. Of course, any King's Indian player now would think the same way. I don't know if I want to give up my light squared bishop for just a pawn, right? Because it's really important attacking piece, right? And he's probably right, actually. So instead, he plays king h8. Prophylaxis, avoiding queen b3 for now. So he just plays a4, fully, you know, isolating that rook on a3. Now is where white kind of starts to go wrong. Although I still prefer black, white should have played something like knight d5 here. You know, of course, if you're white against the King's Indian, you know that you want to get rid of that light squared bishop. So white has ideas with knight b6, trying to attack that light squared bishop. You want to try to trade off that piece. But he played queen d5, supposedly trying to attack d6, I guess, but it's just too slow. And now f4. And this is where you start to see the King's Indian relations come in, right? Close center, and black starts to advance that kingside pawn majority. And now knight h7 is an important move. Black wants to play h5, right? But g5 is weak. So we can't play h5 until we defend that pawn. You may wonder why h7 as opposed to other squares. So a move like knight g8 wouldn't work as well, because then, you know, just say, for example, white just plays something like this. h5 can be met by h4, with the point that if you play g4, white has knight g5. Right, so knight h7 would prevent that, since you could just take it. So knight h7 is an important little detail there. And now these pawns start to advance, and it starts looking pretty bad, right? And, you know, this was already a difficult position for white, but, you know, if white were to take on h3, black has, you know, a number of good moves, but probably simplest is just bishop f6, threatening rook g8, followed by queen h1. Looking very dicey. So he takes on c5, but doesn't work out well either. And black exchanges queens, and in the process ends up 2 pieces, right? White takes, and take on c7, and, you know, pretty easy win for black. But I really like this game. I mean, he played like a masterful King's Indian, basically, even though nobody knew anything about this opening or those attacking ideas at the time. So I find it really amazing that he played this so smoothly, right? I mean, you would have thought this game was for modern times. And just on a different note, you know, that's another good reason why you should play more than just one opening in your chess career at some point. You know, because opening ideas sometimes move over to other openings. I mean, this started out as a Berlin, you know, but it ended up being like a King's Indian defense. So it's good to know how to play different types of openings, right? All right, and for our final game, let's look at a really pretty one against Paulsen. So on this rare occasion, Steinitz felt like playing the King's Gambit. You know, as you know, Lucas was talking about earlier, you know, this wasn't something Steinitz normally loved to play, right? Gambits weren't really his thing, but he would still play every now and then. And what he liked to play a lot was this line with d4. And it's very provocative. And the reason it's very provocative is because after queen h4, white has a problem. If you play g3, black just takes it, and it's not good, right? For example, knight f3 doesn't even work out well because of g2, right? And after you take, black's up full rook, right? Definitely not going to be good. So white has to play this really surprising move, king e2. But it's not as bad as it looks. Now, black is doing okay, by the way. But black has problems to solve. What's going for white is white controls the center, and white's going to play knight f3 and get some tempos on that black queen. So although white's king looks very awkward, white's play in essence is really pretty principled. White's control of the center compensates a lot for it. So d6 is a very sensible move because black wants to play bishop g4 upon knight f3, but it does give white the pawn back. And at this point is where you could look for improvements. Castles is probably fine for black, but the best move, it turns out, is also principled. All right, so instead of castling, whoops. Oh, sorry, I missed a move. Black should play this f5 move, and this is really principled because black's just trying to open up the center. Since white's king is stuck there, you should try to pry it open one way or another. And it turns out this is pretty annoying for white. It's not as easy to find a safe haven for the king now. But black castled queenside, and now king e3. This may look really bizarre, but white's idea is just to attack the black queen, right? Absolute and relative pins are important in chess, right? Although the knight's still pinned, when white takes queen, it's just winning a piece, right? And so black has to move the queen. Now taking at f3, white would just play queen takes, just helping white's development, right? Black doesn't want to take an f3, giving white 2 bishops, helping development, so queen h5. Now bishop b2. Again, breaking the pin, hinting at ideas with h3. And so black moves the queen over to the other side of the board. Turns out this was probably not the best idea. Again, black needs to open up the center, so something like f5 would make a lot more sense. The problem is the queen doesn't turn out to be comfortable on that side of the board either, because now a3. And white has this idea of b4 and knight d5 trapping the queen. Right? For example, knight f6 would stop it, but if you play something stupid like h6, then b4 and knight d5, and your queen's in trouble. You'd have to go back to h5 when queen f5 looks silly to begin with. So a3 is annoying. So black took an f3. This turned out to be not the greatest idea though, although he probably missed white's reply. He took with the king. This may seem surprising, but there's a tactical reason. Bishop takes is the most natural, but that would allow g5 and bishop g7. When it's actually annoying to defend that d4 pawn. If you play knight e2, black can play queen b6, and it's not really so great for white now. So by playing king takes, now g5 doesn't make any sense. He could just play bishop e3, and on bishop g7, he now has b4, and again this knight d5 move. Yeah, so king takes f3. Really surprising reply, but makes a lot of sense when you think about it. So queen goes back to h5, but king e3. King continues to hide in the center. And now the white king goes back to hide at home. Finally, after chilling in the center for a long time. And unfortunately for black, there's just not much counterplay. White has the 2 bishops and this really strong attack on the queen side. So queen g7. Bishop g7 might look more natural in some ways, but the queen was so badly placed on h6. Now b6. Classic attacking, trying to clear lines on the queen side. Now the exchange sacrifice is simply to lock out the queen from the queen side and eliminate a possible defender. Unfortunately, the queen has to go hide in its hole again on g7, and now a5. And unfortunately, black has no way to keep the position closed anymore. Played f5. He's trying to bring his queen over here to defend, but it's really hard to suggest anything else. If instead you play a move like b5, then white just continues to push. And at b6, a7. And unfortunately, black is just not going to be able to keep it closed. But now a takes b, and black has a problem with b takes c7 being threatened. No choice but to take it, but now knight takes. Knight e7. What's wrong with black taking the bishop on g4?
Just queen c3, threatening mate 1. I don't think you can really stop it.
You're exactly right. These kind of quiet moves can be surprising sometimes, but
Right.
the threat of rook a8 just absolutely unstoppable.
What is it? The threat is stronger than the execution?
Exactly, yeah.
Someone told me that the other day.
So knight e7, but now takes at f6. And white has many roads to Rome at this point. Black could have resigned, a while ago, but the end is kind of fun. And finally, rook c6 with a cute checkmate. So, I really like this game, not only because it's fun, but it showed, Steinitz understood chess at a different level than, a lot of, pretty much all of his peers at the time. Paulson was a really strong player in his own right, but he didn't look like it this game. He understood that, although the king was in the center of the board there, white, in principle, had things going for him, control over the center, development, and so he knew it had to be fine. And although it's not spectacular for white, black's okay, it's not losing for white either.
So what else was Steinitz doing during this time? Well, he did write quite a bit. I've talked a lot about his magazine contributions, but he also worked on some books, some tournament books, and then this series called Modern Chess Instructor, and I know there's at least 2 volumes of this particular book, and he spent a lot of time in the early 1890s working on this. And actually, I didn't talk about this very much, but oftentimes at tournaments, he wasn't just a participant, he was a reporter reporting on the tournaments. So while the other players were analyzing games, adjourned positions, going to sleep, whatever, he was writing articles to meet deadlines. So he always worked himself really, really hard. And even while he was trying to defend his world championship title, he was publishing books. I haven't talked about what happened after his wife died. After his wife died, it's kind of humorous. The chess community of New York came together and decided they needed to find him a wife. And here's what a person named Alan Kaufman said. He says, when Wilhelm Steinitz was near the end of his life and in serious financial difficulties, a committee of chess players was formed in New York to assist him. They provided money, an apartment, furniture, and a wife. So in a wife, but there's no verification that they ever actually married. So Elizabeth something or another. We know she was originally from Switzerland, and she took on the name of Steinitz. She was about 17 years old when they got married. She had just immigrated to the United States 2 years before. I should say William Steinitz became a citizen of the United States in, I believe, 1888. So he was a U.S. citizen. They were, I don't know if they were married. There's no marriage license. There's no record of it anywhere. Maybe Steinitz just didn't believe in marriage. I don't know. Maybe he's bohemian in more ways than one. But Steinitz had a son with her named William, coincidentally. William was born in December 1894, and in 1897, a daughter named Julia was born. But it's a little bit fishy, as Landsberger points out. In the year preceding Julia's birth, Wilhelm, or William, the father, was in Europe the whole time. Anyway, conjecture. So Julia was perhaps not his actual biological daughter, but he took care of her. And he also took care of a distant niece, a daughter of his half-brother named Hedwig. Hedwig came and tracked him down in New York and signed herself into the Manhattan Chess Club, actually, which is rare for a woman to do, and went and found her uncle, and he kind of adopted her as a niece/daughter. In Next challenger after Chigorin was Lasker, and Lasker beat Steinitz. Of course, Steinitz, as he was wont to do, spun it. He said, well, if he's going to beat me, he's going to have to beat me with my own style of chess. And Lasker obliged him and did. Now, I should note this was youth experience vanquishing maturity. Steinitz was 58 in their first match. Lasker is 25. I should also note, and I talked about this in the Lasker lecture, Lasker originally promised $3,000 per side. Later, he couldn't raise all that money, and so he asked Steinitz if he would accept $22.50 per side. And Steinitz, with some remorse, said that he would. Now, was that done as a grandiose gesture to give Lasker a chance, or was that because he really needed the money? It's hard to speculate. But Lasker did win that match. Incidentally, if you look in the top picture, you can see there's a crutch that Steinitz had with him at the chessboard. They played again in 1896. But that went even worse for Lasker. He was, toward the end of his chess career, he was quite old at this time. He still gave it his best shot. He was in Moscow for this particular tournament. He did like this extensive tour of Moscow that Chigorin had invited him to, and some wealthy financiers in Moscow had backed. And he played Lasker in Moscow and lost pretty handily. But while he was there, he met a young girl named Polly, and this is a very, very strange story, which I think I should share for a couple of reasons. One, because Steinitz was a bit of a lecher. Toward the end of his life, he favored younger women. And two, because toward the end of his life, he lost some of his mental faculties. And we're not really sure if this is true or not. But apparently he met this girl, and this girl fell in love with him and wanted to marry him. And the uncle who was taking care of this girl, the girl was 18, by the way, wanted to marry him, but there was a small problem of Steinitz being married already. And so Steinitz says she confessed her love for me to her uncle, but he would not permit her to come to me unless I would promise to marry the girl as soon as I could do it legally. She pressured me to write a letter, which I did, to obtain the complete consent of my wife. This way, I think I handled it the right way. From what I understand, the girl is a considerable heiress, and with what I have earned, I could give my wife a yearly compensation, take charge of my little son, and live comfortable in my old age, while maybe my wife could marry a more suitable younger man after the divorce. Strange. And then later on, it says, this part's even better. The wife doesn't respond favorably to this letter. Shocking, I know. And it continues, even though she now came to me with the permission of her uncle, she was obviously instructed to press me to abandon my wife or to morally force her to divorce me. This I refused decisively, whereupon she finally wrote to my wife with the offer, in a manner speaking, to purchase me from her. So this drama is going on while he's contesting his second world championship match with Lasker, and he loses that match right after the story continues with Polly. Right after this match, she supposedly lures him to a meeting where he is arrested and taken to a mental asylum. And he is stuck in this mental asylum against his will from February 9th, 1897, right after this match concludes, until March 12th, when they finally believe that he is a chess player and in fact the former world champion, and let him go. He's not just delusional, claiming he's the world champion. And he goes back quickly to the United States and considers suing the U.S. government for $50,000 because the ambassador in Moscow at the time didn't support his claim. Now, Steinitz did have some mental issues, and I'm going to kind of skip over this in the interest of time, but he talks about having a nervous affliction, right, and being incapacitated, but he still tries to make a good show, and as he was wont to do whenever he felt that he wasn't performing very well in matches or that other people were creeping up on him, he goes and plays international tournaments. So he went to Vienna 1898, and he played with some of the absolute best players of the time. There are only two names on this list who are not among the best, or two names missing from this list of best players, and they are Lasker, who's the glaring missing person. I told you in the Lasker lecture that he didn't go to some of the tournaments because he was studying for his, or was working on his PhD dissertation And whether that's true or not, we can speculate. Maybe he didn't feel the need to. And the other person who wasn't there was Karasek. And I did a lecture on Karasek. It's on, Karasek and Sultan Khan and Nezmetidov. And Karasek had to bow out because of illness. You remember he died at an early age. Now, how did he do at this last major tournament that he competed in? Well, he finished 4th, which is lower than he had finished previously. But he showed, even though he lost pretty handily to the people who finished above him, particularly Janowski, who had his number, he showed that he was still a threat for other people, some up-and-coming people like Schlechter, and still Chigorin, and Maroczy, and Alapin. We recognize these names, of course, the Old Guard and Blackburn. Jackson Showalter, an up-and-coming American player. He showed that he was still able to give them a run for the money and still knock them down a peg if they were thinking that they were the next big thing. However, afterward, his health really deteriorated. This was the last major tournament that he played. In February of 1900, he was taken to a hospital and he was declared legally insane. So he was committed to the Manhattan State Hospital on one of the islands in New York City. And there was a movement to try to get him out, or at least transferred to a nicer facility. That was a state-run facility because they didn't have the money to pay for a nice private facility. And they tried to raise a lot of money. They did get him transferred to another hospital for like 2 weeks, and then he was released from that hospital on April 7th of that same year. But on April 27th, he was taken back to the hospital. It was said that he was violent, combative, that he would spend hours on end walking or limping around a garden outside, that he would have delusions that he was the wealthiest man in the world and give away his money to people on the street, and he didn't really have the money to give away. So they committed him again, and he stayed there until August 12th, 1900, when he died of heart disease, more specifically stenosis of the mitral valve, so inadequate blood flow. Now, he did leave, of course, a lasting legacy on chess. If you talk to, Capablanca said that he was one of the best players of all time. Bobby Fischer said he was one of the best players of all time. Obviously, because Warren's talked about Kasparov's opinion of him. Here's Karpov's opinion. So he still has an impact to this day, but he's not as well known for reasons Warren and I have both discussed, and we think that's to perhaps the detriment, because in many ways he created this modern school of chess, and then other people came along and, Nimzovich, and called it the hyper-modern school of chess, which was, attacking from the sides, among other things, but you can watch the Nimzovich lecture from that. And of course, chess went on to develop beyond what he did, but he certainly contributed, and he wanted to be remembered not only for his contributions to positional chess, but also to opening theory. And Warren covered that a little bit. So, for our sources, I showed you the 2 books that I use. Warren talked to you about the Kasparov book that he used. As we like to do, we certainly could field any questions you might have. We'll try our best.
Just to note that the chessboard, like on Alyakin's grave, is also oriented incorrectly.
Yeah.
Oh no, really?
Yeah, it is. At Alyakin's grave is the same way. In fact,
Same planet or what?
No, the dark square is in the right corner. It should be a light square.
yeah, and in fact, a true story about his headstone, the author of the book, Landsberger, actually visited Steinitz's grave, and before it had just been sitting in the dirt and had fallen over several times, and he actually paid to have it set in concrete. So that's kind of cool. He did that for his distant relative and the subject of the book, but he paid to have that gravestone fixed, but obviously didn't pay for a new one and get the board rotated properly. There are pieces on the board. You can't quite tell from the image, but it's impossible to tell like what pieces are in which, or what colors the pieces are on certain squares. But it's not just like a board where they invite you to play like Alyakin's. Questions about Steinitz?
Good question. What
Yeah.
was the difference when we talked about the Chigorin versus Steinitz World Chess Championship game,
Mhm.
where it was the younger player with the old school versus
Mhm.
the older player with the new school?
Correct.
What were the schools of thought between those? You're talking about modern idea with...
Modern versus romantic.
Okay.
Chigorin was considered part of the old guard in that, and there are a couple different tenets of the modern school: attack, 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 quick development, not worrying so much about how pawn moves create weaknesses, not worrying so much about how the king is involved in a chess game. That's actually one of the things Steinitz said a couple of things. He said, one, the absolute best position on the chessboard is the starting position. It's the safest. And every pawn move is a weakening move. That's one thing he said. Another thing he said is the Romantic school of chess really fails to appreciate the power of the king. The king is not just a defending piece. The king is a powerful piece that should be used more often. And I think you saw in a couple of his games, Steinitz actually made use of his king at various points in the game to shore up defense, to control squares, that sort of thing. And that ran very counter to the style of chess that Morphy played, the style of chess that Chigorin played, the style of chess that Blackburn played, and many of the other players from the mid to late 1800s. Afterward, tactics were not dead. Tactical chess still played a big role in chess. Attacking chess still played a big role in chess. Obviously, Alyekin, strong attacking player. Fischer, Kasparov, attacking players. But we do see quite a bit of his ideas in terms of positional chess, in terms of tenacious defense in the 20th century. And I'm not saying that, Petrosian owes his style to Steinitz. That would be a stretch. But his thinking certainly influenced the development of chess, partly, I think, because he took a very scientific view of chess. Morphy played chess, just, played basically for the enjoyment of the game. Same for a lot of other players, but Steinitz was the first person that I know of that was kind of a chess professional. That was his life, chess, always. He was always writing about it or playing it or something. Most everybody else had some other occupation, and chess was just kind of a side thing. But for Steinitz, it was, something that his life revolved around. It was very important to him. And I think that also is part of that modern school, that to be really good at chess, you have to understand it at a very, very deep level. You have to work at it. Morphy was a brilliant talent, don't get me wrong. But Steinitz arrived at it a different way. And actually, a lot of critics would say, oh, so-and-so is more brilliant. Chigorin is more brilliant than Steinitz. You see that a lot. But like I said, the proof is in the results. And until he was in his 60s, Steinitz was the undisputed world champion and held off all sorts of comers. Other questions? Yeah.
Was everybody born in a place like Prague in those days considered Austrian because it was part of the Habsburgs?
Yeah, they more specifically Bohemia, the Bohemian region of the Prussian Empire. So yes, he was considered Bohemian or Austrian. You could use them somewhat interchangeably. But after he took on and in fact, this is a debate, I suppose, that people could discuss, but some people say he was the first American champion, because he took on U.S. citizenship, and he spent the last 16 years of his life with his home in New York City and with Montclair, New Jersey, sorry. So, but yes, he was Bohemian or Austrian by birth. He certainly had that passport, and he kept it all the way until when he lived in the United States, when he started traveling under an American passport and anglicized his name from Wilhelm to William. So, and he talked very glowingly about the United States, particularly the tolerance for immigrants, which is something he didn't experience in England, It's a very stratified society, very biased society. And he also talks about the treatment of Jews in the United States, how he didn't feel nearly the same levels of anti-Semitism that he felt even in his native Austria, much less England. So Steinitz, perhaps at the end of his life, considered himself American, but by birth, yes, Austrian would be a correct nationality to attribute to him. Anything else? All right, thank you guys. I'm going to cut off the recording. Feel free to stick around and chat if you like.